Hi, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I'm going to be connecting one of the auxiliary switches. I'm going to be using auxiliary 1 to idle up the engine. Now to do that, we use these customer access connections here to wire in using a wiring schematic that Ford provides online. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be applying power from the auxiliary 1 switch. In this bundle here are the auxiliary switches. So we've got 4 of them. And the yellow one is for auxiliary 1, and I'm going to be using that to engage basically the PTO circuit. So PTO request 1 is going to be connected to this yellow wire. PTO request 1 is a yellow wire with a green stripe, green tracer, which is going to be this one here. So I'm going to get a little jumper wire to put between there because it's not quite long enough to reach. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then we also need to install a resistor. The resistor is used to tell the engine what RPM value to set the idle at. And there is the capability to put a potentiometer there instead of a resistor, so you can have a variable speed set using that potentiometer. But for my application, I'm just going to use a fixed RPM. I'm going to be using probably about a 20K resistor, which should set the idle at about 1200 RPM. I'm going to see what I have for resistor options in my kit, and I'd like to get a little bit lower, down to maybe like a 16K to get about 1300 RPM. But I'll see what's in my kit, what I have available. Worst case, I know I have some 20K resistors, so that's fine. No issues there. Document in the description, but this is the document that I referenced that gave me some wiring diagrams, and it gave me the information about which size resistor to use, depending on the RPM that was wanted. And this also is a great resource. It gives information about how the circuits function, how they're supposed to function. So I just wanted to show you briefly what that is. So right here, top right, it says this for 2016 model year. It should be the same 11 through 16. And this does include the E series as well as the F series, so the E350, 450, and then the F Super Duties, and then Transit. So this document, so I'm just going to jump straight to 14 and start looking there regarding the SEIC/PTO circuit. So it starts by kind of giving some brief information about the auxiliary switches, the upfitter switches that are on the dash. You may or may not have those in your truck. If you do not, you can install your own switch, or you can purchase this kit to install the auxiliary switches. It is something that can be added aftermarket, so, or not aftermarket, but through the dealer purchasing the hardware. So let's go ahead and go down to the next page. So here it gives a brief description of the customer accessible signals. So these are, depending on whether you have diesel or gasoline engines, these are those wires that are underneath the dash on the driver's side that I was tying into. So these are signals. So if you needed the park output, neutral output, vehicle speed output, or engine speed output, those wires are there. Let's go down a little bit more. So here's a description of the circuits that are available down there. There are additional circuits. So gasoline is over here on the left, diesel is on the right, and it goes through. So the ones I used were, so this is PTO switch 1, and I used that one in conjunction with the PTO RPM and PTO reference. So putting a resistor between PTO reference and PTO RPM will set the idle. If you are using a potentiometer, then you would need to incorporate the PTO return as well. There is a BCP, battery charge protect circuit available, as well with a BCP lamp. I originally was going to use this circuit, but I found that it wasn't as helpful as what I wanted. So I did not end up going with that. It's got some photos of those pass-through wires that I show you in the video. And then we have the drawing here for the diesel, drawing here for a 5.4 gas, and then the BCP as well. And then here's the chart that I referenced for choosing the resistor. based on the RPM threshold I was looking for. So I wanted around 1300 RPM. And so I went with a 1500, or I'm sorry, a 15K ohm resistor. So right here in the middle, depending on what target RPM you're looking for, you can vary that. And then with the resistors, if you put them in series, then you just add the resistance of each resistor that is in series. So I could have added, I had a 15. If I wanted 16K, I could have grabbed my 15 and then soldered it in series with a 1K ohm resistor and had my 16, but I didn't think it was worth it for the, I think it was 25 RPM difference that would give me. So I opted not to do that. And then it gives some more transmission specifications. This is more for bodybuilders that are tying into a PTO, and this gives some reference information with that. Yeah, that's it. I'll put a link to this in the description so that you guys can take a look. It's just useful to read through it and kind of have an idea, understanding of what's going on before going through and taking on this task. It gives an overview of how it's supposed to function. So that is there as well. So first step is going to be applying, like I said, applying power to this, which engages the PTO, and then finding the two circuits that control the RPM value. Depending on your truck, you may have this tag here. This tag gives you a brief, I guess, description of what each wire is. So looking here, blue with the white tracer is PTO relay. It's the top one. Brown is for BCP lamp, which is a battery charge protection circuit. So that's a lamp when that's engaged. Anyway, it goes through and tells you everything, what all these customer access connections are for. And so you can use that. I'm going to look at the drawing because the drawing gives me a little bit more detail about what I'm connecting to where. I believe what I'm going to be connecting to is a PTO reference to PTO RPM. Okay, so I found a 15K ohm resistor in my kit of resistors, and what that should give me as far as RPM, that should give me 1325. So basically for every K ohm, it's 25 RPM. So the difference between a 1200 RPM and 1400 RPM is about 8K ohm. So splitting the difference there between 20 and 12 K ohms would be 16, which would be right at 1300 RPM. But since this is a 15K ohm, then it's going to set it right at 1325, which is close enough for me. It's not worth the hassle of putting two resistors in series to get it at exactly 1300. So I'm going to go ahead and do the resistor first, get that squared away, soldered in, and then we'll go ahead and tackle that auxiliary switch power wire. All right, so here are some of the tools I'm going to be using doing this upgrade. So I've got some cutters, wire strippers, piece of wire, some zip ties for when I'm all done, a butane soldering iron, a brush for my flux and solder, and then the resistors, and then an assortment of heat shrink. So that's primarily what I'm going to be using. I do have a light as well, so that's also helpful. I think that's it. You don't have to use what I'm using. You can use butt connectors. There are other options available. This is just what I'm choosing to do and how I'm choosing to do it. All right, so here's the resistor. I'm going to go ahead and cut these legs down a little bit. They're longer than is needed for this application. So I'm going to give myself about maybe 3/4 of an inch or so to make the connection. And then that way it'll also use less heat shrink. So there it is. There's my resistor that I'll be wiring it. So I'm looking for a solid green wire, which I believe is this guy here. So I'm going to go ahead and strip some of this back. And to make things easier, I'm going to pull the wire out of this tag that's on there. So that way I'm not having to work around that guy. All right, so I'm going to wrap that together kind of like that. I'm going to see if I can get some flux on my brush here and brush it onto here just a little bit. Should be plenty. And fire up the torch. Torch nice and warm. You have to be careful when using a butane torch because there is an exhaust port here where a lot of heat comes out of. So you want to make sure if you're using this in tight, confined areas that you have it pointed away from anything that's going to be distorted by that heat. So put a little bit of solder on the tip there, and then I'll apply that tip to the wire, and then I'll add just a little bit more, something like that. So the other wire that we're going to be connecting to is white with a brown stripe. So we're going to look for that. I believe it's this one here, but to me that looks more like a black stripe. So I'm just ruling out all of the other white wires. And yeah, that looks like it is going to be our wire that we're going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that out of this label. All right, so there's our wire. And then back to this connection, give it a little pull test. It looks good, no concerns there. So I'm going to go and strip this wire now. I'm stripping about maybe ½ inch or so in length. Now I need to put some heat shrink on there. I think that should be more than enough to cover the whole thing. Depending on your application, you may not want to cover your resistor. You may need to cool. But being that this is an electronic circuit, we're sending a signal to, there's really going to be no load through this resistor, so we don't have to worry about heat. So that being the case, I'm just going to heat shrink over the whole thing. All right, something like that. Grab my brush with some flux on it. The flux just helps the wire take the solder. So if you don't have flux, it's not super critical. It just helps make things easier for in this application. And I wipe the tip off after each use. So you can see there's no solder on the tip there. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little solder there. Add a little puddle, just enough so it doesn't start dripping. And then I'm going to apply that to the wire. And then I'm going to add more solder to that. So like that. And that connection is done. We'll give it a second to set, and then we'll also do a pull test on it. And it's solid. Okay, so now let's go ahead and put our heat shrink, slide our heat shrink down. Something like that. And now I can use that exhaust port on my soldering iron to shrink this tubing. And the tubing that I'm using does have the adhesive in it, so you should see that pop out like on this end here. You can see some of that glue is squishing out. And that just helps seal the connection, the repair or whatnot from any elements or moisture or any of that sort of stuff. All right, so I can see the glue coming out on that side as well. So now that's done. And I'm going to go ahead and test that part of it before I continue and make sure that we are good with our connection and our resistor. And to properly test this, I'm going to go ahead and start the engine. So let's go ahead and test the resistor setting that we have installed. So this yellow with the green stripe is our PTO request 1. If I apply power using this power probe, it should elevate the idle. If I look at the cluster, it's right around 1300 RPM. All right, so next step is to wire in from this yellow wire here, which is our upfitter switch, our dash switch, auxiliary switch on the dash. So from the yellow one here to the yellow with the green stripe, this basically applies power when that switch is in the on position. So I'm going to go ahead and shut the engine off and connect that up. All right, so this is the wire that I'm going to be using to span that gap. And I'm going to go ahead and strip about 1/2 inch off of the end of the wire here. And then same thing with the wire up here. Going to take about 1/2 inch, right about there. And then same thing with this wire over here. Oh yeah, and I'm going to also pull this out of the paper label. All right, so there's the yellow wire. And the main reason I'm pulling it out of there away from these other ones is just so that it's easier to route and tie up. It makes it look, and I'll be able to make it look more clean the way I tie it up than dealing with this label and having to come out and go back in or whatever. So yeah, these two wires are almost long enough to touch. They're about maybe 2 inches apart. So I am, let's see, where should I start? I think I'm going to attach the wire here first. It doesn't really make much of a difference. I just figure that I'll do this connection first and then I'll do the other connection. And because the other end of this yellow wire is currently not connected to anything, I can slide the heat shrink on later and not worry about it right at this moment. All right, so we got those two twisted together. I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit of flux. So when the torch is hot enough, you'll see it start to smoke. The tip of the soldering iron will start to smoke. And now I should melt the solder. And we're gonna go ahead and put a little puddle there on the end, just enough that it doesn't drip off. And we're gonna use that puddle against the wire to heat it. Then we're gonna add some more solder. And that'll do it. And we'll go ahead and look at this connection here. Spin it around. I don't know if the light is drowning out the connection, but so that'll do. And let's see, I'm going to follow the wire up this way. So I'm going to cut it about here. And then strip it about 1/2 inch or so. And then I do need to slide that heat shrink on before I get too far ahead of myself. You want to make sure that when you're choosing a heat shrink size, that you pick a size larger than your joint. So this joint up here, it's a little bit larger than the wire or the insulation even here. So I just want to make sure I pick a big enough size that it's not going to be an issue when trying to get the heat shrink over it. So I think this heat shrink should work. Yep, looks good. I'll heat that later when I do this lower one, and then I'll use the same size for this guy. Okay, I'll twist the two together. What I do is I usually just make an X with the copper, and then I'll twist one side around until it's nice and tight, and then I'll go to the other side and get that one nice and tight, and then I'll try to straighten out the wire because sometimes there's a little bit of a bend to it, so that when it solders in a straight line. And then to grab some flux, so it doesn't take much flux, just a little bit. It's not a huge wire or a huge connection. I'll wait for the torch to warm up. Like I said, when it's done, the tip should start smoking. Even though I wipe this off after each use, it still has some residual stuff on it, so it will smoke. And that'll be an indicator. The other thing you can do is just tap it with the solder, and when it's warm enough, it will melt it. So there, it's warm. Put a little puddle there on our tip, and we'll put the tip on, or we'll put the puddle on our wire, and then feed in some more solder. I'll move the tip over, move the solder around, and then that'll do it. And then let's look at the solder joint. All right, so we got on the back side, we got most of it covered with solder. So there's a little bit of a gap here at the end. Let's add a little bit more solder. It's already pretty warm, so we'll put our puddle on there. Try to feed in some more. Weird angle. All right, so there. Took the solder. Okay, so if we look at it, kind of twist it around so that you can see. It looks pretty good. So yeah, I'll go ahead and slide the heat shrink over it, and then we'll go ahead and shrink the tubing. So heat shrink tubing doesn't need a lot of heat. You could use a heat gun. You could even use a lighter. I prefer to use the torch because I've already got it out, and you can see the glue is coming out on both ends, so that's a good sign. There we go. And same thing, we got the glue coming out on either side. That means it's good and sealed. It's a good connection. All right, so I guess the camera app messed up and did not record me putting this all back together. But as you can see here, we have our yellow wires tied up. We tied up all of our customer access wires that aren't being used there. And then behind the label here is our heat shrink with our two connections. So this one in the back here is, we wanted to keep that straight to prevent the resistor legs from having too much stress on them. So anyway, that's pretty much it. Tied up back here the other wires for the other auxiliary switches. So yep, that is done. Now to go ahead and test it, show you that it works. Go ahead and start the truck. All right. So when I flip auxiliary 1, the engine RPM increases right there at about 1300. I haven't connected a scan tool to confirm exactly what the RPM range is, but it looks good to me. And then if I flip the switch off, ramps back down. And that is tied to this switch here, auxiliary 1. All right, so that's it for this video. Hope everything was straightforward for you. Let me know in the comments what you might be using your auxiliary switches for, or what the reason you might want to increase your RPMs and what RPM range you're going for. Definitely interested to hear that. Also, please feel free to share and like, and of course subscribe so that you know when I release new content. I do have several new videos ready to post. I just need to edit them regarding some truck maintenance that I've recently performed, and I'm going to get those up here shortly. So take a look at those. Let me know what you think in the comments, and you guys have a good one. Take care.